everyone, you're watching Politically Correct. All eyes around the world are on the current migration crisis. The numbers say it all. Over 11 million people have so far been displaced. And the UN has predicted by the end of 2015 there could be 4.27 million Syrian refugees, the worst exodus since the Rwandan genocide 20 years ago. Closer to home, here in Kenya, we have been facing a refugee crisis of our own. Kenya happens to be home of the world's largest refugee camp, the infamous Dadaab, which the government threatened to close down earlier this year. Here in studio with me today, I have spokesperson for UNHCR Kenya, Emmanuel Nyabera, to shed some light on the current refugee situation in Kenya and global crisis as well. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking some time to stop by.
Thank you so much.
I would like us to just first off start off by, what is the current refugee situation like in Kenya? What are the numbers? How many are there? Where are they from? And how many camps do we have in the country so far?
So far, we have more than 600,000 refugees in the country. Majority of them are in the Dadaab refugee camp in northeastern part of Kenya. Mm-hmm. And out of that, around 350,000 that are in Dadaab, almost 96% of them are from Somalia. Mm-hmm. Then we have Kakuma refugee camp in northwestern part of Kenya, bordering southern Sudan. And in that camp, we have around 280,000 refugees. Mm-hmm. Most of them are from southern Sudan, but we also have Somalis there. In Kakuma, we have so many refugees from different nationalities, from the Great Lakes region, like I said, from South Sudan, from Somalia, Great Lakes region, a few from Uganda, from Ethiopia, from Eritrea. So we're talking about a situation where Kenya is hosting so many refugees from different nationalities.
Mm-hmm. All right, and in terms of the camps, what are the camps like? Could you just paint a picture for all the people and the viewers that are watching right now? What goes on in the camps? What's the environment like? Could you describe that for me?
Actually, I keep saying that we shouldn't call them camps. We should call them refugee resettlements, or settlements, actually refugee settlements, because there are people who are born in these places, and now they have their own families there. These so-called camps were established more than 21 years ago. So there are people who've been there for a long time, they've evolved, they've started, they're moving on with their lives, they have the businesses, we have schools, we have hospitals. I will mention that even before free education system was introduced in Kenya, already we were providing free education in these camps. And the host community, the people around there who are Kenyans, had access to these facilities. So we have really running environments. I mean, and people have to know that human beings, when they fall down, they don't stay down. They get up and walk. And when you go to these settlements or the camps, then you realize that people don't stay. There are businesses going on. We have food distribution twice given by WFP, World Food Program, twice in a month. We have people who are going through education system, but also not just within that area, but also now we are introducing other aspects of education. Like even some of the universities are establishing themselves in these areas, which means that refugees are having access to education across the board.
So it really is like sort of like a small town.
Definitely, it's a small town. I mean, it's not a small town. It's a big town, because if you talk about a place where you have 350,000 people, at a certain stage it was around 400,000 people in Dadaab. That's a big town. You can compare that with Kisumu. You can compare that almost with Nakuru. So it's in terms of numbers, it's a big town, and a big town goes with so many things. Security issues have to be taken into consideration. So we work very closely with the government of Kenya to ensure that security is taken care of. So we have a lot of stuff that we're doing, a lot of things that we're doing with the government of Kenya to ensure that we work together, to ensure that refugees, who are people like you and I, lead a dignified life.
Indeed, you've highlighted how you have worked with the government in addressing the problem, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But before we get into that, what I really want to speak about is you've talked about it being a small town. And that's interesting for me because I think a lot of people have these preconceptions or have this, perceptions that may be wrong of the camps of refugee people. And so what are some of these misconceptions that people hold or negative views that we hold that are incorrect?
I think what I will say is that the first thing that we have to know is that refugees are human beings like you and I. Mm-hmm. So refugee settlements or camps, we call them camps. Mm-hmm. We have women, we have children, we have elderly people, we have children who've been born there, who are going to school. Mm-hmm. And anybody can be a refugee. Mm-hmm. Nobody decides to be a refugee. But there's certain aspects of life that makes you cross the border and go to a different place. Actually, that's the definition of refugee. You have to cross the border and go to a different country. Because of things like conflicts, nowadays even things like famine, globally it's changing a lot. So many things are making people cross the border to go and seek refuge, to go and look for a place where they can go and be able to take care of their families, be able to go on with their lives.
And that's where the term refugee comes from, really, is from refuge.
Exactly.
Refuge.
It's refuge. You have to cross the border. Normally there's confusion between IDPs and refugees. Internally displaced persons are people who have not crossed the border, but they're displaced within their own country. But for you to be a refugee, you have to cross the border and go to a different country and seek asylum in another country. So one thing is that anybody in this world can be. We have seen in Kenya situations where, after the post-election violence, some Kenyans crossed into Uganda. Some of them just came back almost, 3 months ago.
Really?
Yes, and we helped them together with the government of Uganda and our government and to bring them back. So IDPs are there, but refugees are also there. And I think it's very important for people to know the distinction between the two.
And also, you've talked about IDPs and refugees. What about migrants and refugees then? What's the line between the two?
It's becoming more and more difficult because initially there are people who would come to another country because of economic reasons. And initially, all the descriptions that we had about this of migrants or let me say refugees, was because of conflict. But we are having situations where people cannot handle security situations in the countries. I'm talking about Syria, I'm talking about Iraq now, and I'm talking about, what's happening in the Middle East, Libya, where because the government is no longer there, because there's conflict, and then they know that they have to move on with their lives. So they have to move to a country where they feel like they'll be accommodated and they can continue with their lives. Everybody wants to be happy. Everybody wants to continue with their lives.
And now, in terms of the refugee situation here in Kenya, would you say it's a crisis?
I will say it becomes overwhelming. I wouldn't use the word crisis, but overwhelming. Because, first of all, I would say that Kenya is one of the countries that has been extremely accommodative to refugees. I mean, we are only, in Africa, we're only second to Ethiopia. For a long time, Kenya had the most refugees in Africa. After the Southern Sudanese crisis, around 2 years ago, then we had so many of them go to Ethiopia. So in terms of numbers, Ethiopia is leading in terms of the numbers. But Kenyans have been extremely accommodative to refugees. But what I will also say is that we have to know that when refugees come, they don't just come as desperate people, they also come to contribute towards what's happening in the country of asylum. Kenya, when there was a crisis in Uganda during Idi Amin's time, most of the teachers crossed the border and came to Kenya from Makerere, from other universities and other institutions, and they crossed the border and they came down to Kenya, and most of them taught in schools. Artists. So some of them come and we share ideas and you get to know that diversity is positive. So refugees, when they come to a country of asylum, they don't just come because they're desperate and they know nothing. They make their contributions towards the economy and the well-being of the country of asylum.
Okay, as much as you've said that, it's not really a crisis per se, but you have said that it is overwhelming. And so what are the challenges that you are facing right now as UNHCR, the government of Kenya, facing in this refugee situation?
Challenges, first of all, I think in terms of, we must say that we're very grateful to the donor countries, because sustaining a refugee program like this for a long time is not easy. So we thank the donors. But we know that there's so many other emergencies coming up from different places. And again, I would refer to the Middle East, talk about Iran, talk about, not Iran, I'm going to talk about Iraq. We're talking about Syria, Libya. So we have a situation where the funding is diverted to these new emerging emergencies. So our appeal all the time is to ask the donors that don't forget about the situation that we have in Kenya and other areas that we have the what you call protracted refugee situation that have been there for a long time. So people shouldn't forget that we have a crisis in a place like Kenya and divert the attention to the new emerging situations. The other thing is definitely we have taken into consideration the interest of the host community. Because if you are, let me say, 3,000 people, 4,000 people in one place, then all of a sudden you have 10,000 people coming, then definitely environment is affected, the ecosystem. So, I mean, so we have to really all the time make sure that we take into consideration the interest of the host community and that of the refugees, so that we promote the coexistence between them, peaceful coexistence between the host community and refugees. So this is something that we're putting a lot of effort to ensure that we take into consideration both.
All right, you talked of the donors who are contributing to sustain the programs that you are rolling out right now in regards to the refugee situation. Could you just highlight some of these programs that are ongoing in the refugee situation?
First of all, I mean, we have to look at the situations like the life-saving situations, food, which is handled by World Food Programme, water, because every human being has to get water, sanitation, because if sanitation is not sufficient, then we have diseases. So these are the what we call life-saving engagements, let me put it that way.
Basic survival
Exactly,
needs.
basic survival needs. But at the same time, now you have also see long-term preparations, for example, education is very important. Because, I mean, this world nowadays, if without education, you have a problem. So we have to have schools. We have to have, again, look at situations like, unique situations like women and children. What do they need? You know, women, for example, one thing we have seen in terms of education, if you don't take care of things like sanitary ware, you know, then you have women not going to, girls not going to school. We have to look at unique situations, unique needs by different categories of people. Children, women, old people, trauma. Because when you have people who have run away from the countries because of war or conflict, some of them are traumatized. So counseling needs have to be taken into consideration. You know, so we really have people on the ground to identify certain needs or unique needs that have to be attended to all the time.
And of course, there's also things like medical care and other, sectors that need to be addressed in that area. But I think for a very long time, the refugee situation has been seen like a very negative thing, where it's, draining the country's economy. We have to set aside budgets to be able to assist these programs that go on. And it reminds me of this quote, the old saying goes, each problem has hidden in it an opportunity so powerful that it literally dwarfs the problem, as quoted by Joseph Sugarman. And I just want to ask you, how can the refugee situation be turned into an opportunity for Kenya rather than it being a problem?
What I will say is that refugees come with a lot to offer in a country of asylum. You know, if you look at the history, Esteban was a refugee. There's so many people who made it. Kagame was a refugee. There's so many people who made it in this world that initially were refugees, but later on, they picked up the bags and walked on. So one thing that we have to realize all the time, that anybody who crosses the border and comes down here has something to offer. So it's not negative all the time. And that's why my appeal all the time is that we have to be tolerant. We have to be tolerant, we have to accept these people, we have to bring them in, and we have to see how we can benefit from their presence amongst us. There are three main solutions for refugees. One is to go back home. Everybody wants to go back home. Most of the time I go and talk to refugees, and I go there quite often. Everybody wants to go home. Everybody wants to go and see where their ancestors came from. The second one is resettlement, which means that certain situations where we take them to another country, but mainly the vulnerable ones, or the ones who seek education, and so they go to third country, like Australia, like the US, or other places. Then the other one is local integration. That has not been very, very positive in African situation, but we've had countries that have encouraged refugees to settle amongst them. And my point is that when you get people who have skills, like artists, like people who come and tell you things that you didn't know about, then you gain from that. It's a positive thing. So one thing is that we can't say that all the time the presence of refugees in a country of asylum is negative. For me, I look at it as a positive thing, as long as we work together and see how we can integrate them.
All right, thank you for those comments. We need to take a short break, but when we come back, maybe we can explore what the government and what UNHCR has done in terms of response and the impact that we've had. And also, of course, policy, because I'm sure in terms of policy development, there's still a lot more that we can do as a country. And so we're taking a quick break, but make sure that you keep it tuned here at TVC. When we come back, more with the spokesperson for UNHCR.